Happy to welcome Colonel John Morris, who is our presenter this evening on General John Vessey Day in Minnesota, state proclaimed day in honor of his birthday. As his grandson noted to me this morning, General Vessey would have been 100 years old today. So fitting that we gather and remember his life and legacy, because it did have such a profound impact, certainly on Minnesota history as well as national and global history. So have asked Colonel Morris to share his research in advance of publication of his biography on General Vessey, which is upcoming, I believe, soon. And no doubt John can tell us more about that exact day, perhaps. It's a work in progress. But please do understand, Colonel Morris is a good friend of the museum, a dear friend. We've worked together in the past. He gathered at one of our Vietnam War roundtables and shared the story of the Battle of Sui Tre, where General Vessey was instrumental in leadership. Colonel Morris is a 31-year Army veteran himself and soon-to-be biographer of General John Vessey's story. And so with that, would welcome Colonel Morris to share his story about writing the book about General Vessey. Colonel Morris, good evening.
Well, good evening, Randal, and to everybody who's giving up a beautiful summer evening to learn about a great Minnesotan, great American. It's an honor to be here, and I want to thank you, Randal, for all the hard work you're doing to preserve the history of military members in Minnesota, and most particularly, probably our greatest soldier from Minnesota, General Vessey, General Nash, who's on the line here today as well. Thank you for all you've done, sir, to preserve General Vessey's legacy and to codify it in the archives there at the Military Museum of Minnesota, which I hope becomes a place future scholars will come and dig and find the gold mine of information about this great man. I'm going to tell you here in the first 20 minutes a little bit about how I became involved in General Vessey's life and how that led to the book, and give you a run-up to his being chosen very surprisingly to him and to the Department of Defense as the 10th chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I've been working on this since 2017. I knew General Vessey for the last 6 years of his life as a result of a phone call from General Nash, who was the Adjutant General of Minnesota at the time, after the Vessey family reached out to the Minnesota National Guard in the aftermath of a terrible automobile accident that General Vessey had when he was returning to his Minnesota home after a Defense Science Board meeting at the Pentagon. And it looked like he may die, and the family wanted an Army chaplain to be present. I went to the emergency room at the behest of General Nash and started an incredible ministry, which turned into a beautiful friendship with General Vessey. But I'm going to tell you right away, I thought that I knew General Vessey, but really what I knew was a tip of the iceberg. And I knew what he allowed me to know based on my ability to understand the context of who he had been. So I say that to you to say I wasn't the brightest guy, and he didn't feed me the graduate level information. When I dug into the archives and found out what a titan he was, and as I was serving in the Pentagon in my final years in the Army, it was a shock to me to find that nobody had written a book about him, and that he was quickly disappearing from the memory of the institution of the Army and from the Department of Defense's purview. So I set about to make that right. I contacted the Association of the United States Army book writing arm. They agreed there was an egregious error and it needed to be addressed. And I was hoping they had an author in mind, and they said, well, why don't you write it? You know, I'd spent most of my public school years in the Mississippi public schools, so that'll help you understand what a daunting task this was. Made much easier by the work of General Nash in hiring a good oral historian from Concordia University in St. Paul to interview General Vessey and compile a great oral history, which was basically raw data for me that enabled me to gain some context and then go into the original sources and find the records, understand what he did. So that's how I got involved. There's the public story about General Vessey that we in the Minnesota Guard and some Minnesotans on this day know pretty well. The private to general, only person in the United States Army history to hold every rank of the Army of his day, 10th chairman of the Joint Chiefs, great teller of Ole and Lena jokes, and a lover of baseball. General Vessey burnished that story and used it with an amazing skill that he had to deflect attention from himself or to diffuse tension with humility and humor. So for most people, that's really all they know about General Vessey. But I'm going to make a bold proposition here. This is the general that led the victory over the Soviet Union. Full stop. This is the general that led us to victory over the Soviet Union. We had a world war called the Cold War, and the United States and its allies won it. And this is the man who took us in the final battles to victory. He would blush to hear me say that, but I've written a book to try to support that. I'm going to share that with you today. You see on the screen his official portrait. I visited it many, many times in the Pentagon, across from the tank and across from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs office. It's right in the middle of the 21 portraits that are there. It is very unique. And I'm going to walk you through it because it holds the clues of who the man really is. It's unique of all of the portraits that are there. And I'm again proposing he is the most unique chairman we've had to date. And I highly doubt we'll see another of his caliber. You see on the table in front of General Vessey, first you see the table circular. General Vessey made a big point when he became the chairman to move a rectangular desk out of his office and move a circular desk in, actually a meeting table that was circular, as a symbol of collaboration for the service chiefs. A tremendous hallmark of his leadership, the ability to pull disparate people with strong opinions together in a common cause. That's how we won the Cold War. Jack Vessey pulling together tough people and getting them to move in the same direction. He's got his Bible on that table. He's the only chairman of the Joint Chiefs with the Bible anywhere in that portrait. Vessey's the only guy to ever be the featured speaker at the National Prayer Breakfast of the United States, an annual event, the largest event of its kind in the United States, held in the Capitol. He is the only military leader to ever speak and the only chairman of the Joint Chiefs. This is a venue that's had Mother Teresa speak. So you get a sense of the quality of speakers. He was a man of unabashed Christian faith who allowed that faith to inform his values. And he held to those values in extremely difficult times and places, both on the battlefield and in the political world of Washington. And in the things I'm writing, I'm trying to make some pointed statements to the era that we're in, as the military has seen some pretty unseemly things done by its leadership, and as we've had some chaotic political times. Vessey was a man who could not be bought and who could not be swayed from his moral compass. And that Bible's there to tell all viewers that, and he backed it up with his actions. Over his left shoulder, you see a picture of Italy. It's really unique. And again, and many of the chairmen have pictures of things that are significant in their careers in the background of the portraits. He has the nation of Italy. And I simply say that's where he was forged in fire, and he left with a commitment to making sure American military members had the best technology on the battlefield, the best training, and the best leadership possible. He had a very simple philosophy, and it was around those things. Great equipment, not marginal equipment like he had in Italy. Great leadership, not what he saw in the American Army of his time. Despite some great exceptions to the rule, he saw a lot of mediocrity and even substandard leadership that led to the needless death of American soldiers. And he wasn't going to have that if he was going to be a leader. He was tremendously committed to tough, realistic training. And that'll come up later in his career here as one of the reasons that he was chosen. And then leadership with a capital L, which is what you see in the right corner as he's shaking the hands of an elderly gentleman. That painting is based on a real picture. That's General Bolte, who was General Vessey's division commander from 1943 to 45 in Italy. General Bolte, that picture was taken after General Vessey's retirement ceremony, where General Bolte was the master of ceremonies for the retirement of the 10th chairman of the Joint Chiefs. It's a symbol of how close these two men became and how Bolte became the model leader and mentor for Vessey throughout his career, all the way through his time as the chairman. They also held similar positions in the Army, to include the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. Vessey looked to Bolte and his style of leadership as his own. Quiet leadership, not arrogant, not boasting, not seeking public attention in any way, technically proficient and apolitical. Bolte modeled it, Vessey imbibed of it and embodied it throughout his career. It's a beautiful example of leaders impacting leaders through example and mentoring. So that gives you some of the clues as to the man that Ronald Reagan found when he went on a search for chairman to replace Dave Jones, who was in the position when Reagan came into office and had been selected by President Carter. Could have stayed on, but Reagan wanted a different man. And he picked Vessey, and I'll get you through all of those things. But let me tell you how Vessey got there. Much is known about his World War II experience, but little what happened after World War II. Well, what happened was 20 years of anonymity, doing the common assignments that an artillery officer would do in the Army, not rising to any level that would gain the attention of others, excelling in everything he did. But really, by 1961, Vessey was seriously considering retirement. He's done 20 years, he can get a federal pension, and he's considering the ministry. And what I'm trying to tell you here is there wasn't anything remarkable in those 20 years that would mark him out as the future chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He was, like many of his generation, a hardworking, bright, dedicated soldier who did what he's told, went where he was sent, and took on the jobs that he was given and excelled, but wasn't on any fast track or general's radar to be raised up through the ranks above anybody else. In fact, he didn't even have a college degree. By the end of 1960, he's finishing 2 years of college through a variety of night school and correspondence classes. So this isn't a Brahmin out of West Point. This is a hardworking artillerist who kept his head down and did what he was told. But in 1966, he gets assigned to Vietnam, and everything changes. He's assigned to the 25th Division, whose general is General Fred Wyand, who goes on to be the Chief of Staff of the Army at a later date. And Wyand sees Vessey's brilliance. Not only does he see his brilliance, as Vessey basically reforms the artillery performance of the 25th Division and turns a unit's artillery that's hard to coordinate and synchronize into a really lethal battlefield weapon system. But he also sees Vessey's valor in the Battle of Sui Tre, where the American Army had the largest taking of North Vietnamese life in the entire 10-year time frame that we fought in Vietnam. Vessey's unit, less than 500 men, surrounded by a North Vietnamese regiment. He not only held them off, but he beat them into retreat against amazing odds. Calm, amazing leadership. Caught General Wyand's eye, and it caught Dutch Kerwin's eye, who was an artillerist of his own right, famous from Anzio, by this time a general. And Vessey goes in the little black book of these officers as a man to keep his eye on. By 1970, it looks like Vessey's going to become a general, and he's going to take an assistant division command of the 25th Division in Hawaii. But as so often happened in Vessey's career, while everybody else is advancing, he gets sidetracked. The division commander is killed in Vietnam, a new commander appointed who doesn't know Vessey, and he tells Vessey, I want my guy. And Vessey shunted off to run the logistics in Thailand for the war effort in Laos and Vietnam. Seemingly a backwater assignment, a career-ending assignment. In Vessey fashion, however, he does an outstanding job in Thailand and gathers the attention of no less than Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird, who's looking for somebody to run the war in Laos while we're trying to negotiate in Paris with the North Vietnamese and put heat on the North Vietnamese to bring them to some sort of an agreement that we can withdraw from South Vietnam and Vietnamize the war. Vessey has a role in Laos that is gigantic and largely unknown. But I'll whet your appetite with this. 1972, General Vessey, the Hmong and the Laotian army destroyed 2 North Vietnamese regular divisions on the Plain of Jars. 2 divisions. That's no little feat. 1 general, irregular forces, and a lot of B-52s. How that was done was amazing to read about. But that catches General Abrams, who's running the war in Vietnam's attention, and Vessey goes into Abrams' little black book. And he's called out of Laos to the Pentagon, and Vessey's one of the architects of the post-Vietnam military. And one of the things he has his fingers on is utilization of the Guard and Reserve, which I benefited from, General Nash and other members of the Guard. Vessey's the one that works with Abrams to figure out how the Guard could be equipped and trained and ready to participate in the next war and not left home as it was during Vietnam. He is selected to be a division commander, goes out to the 4th Division, and begins to do great work there, and is pulled back to the Pentagon in less than a year, and made the deputy chief of operations and plans for the Army, the number 3 position in the Army, which marks him out then as the future chief of staff of the Army. So in a matter of 3 or 4 years, he's gone from a brigadier general hardly known to the man that the Army has decided is going to be its chief. From the Pentagon, then he's sent to Korea to lead all Allied forces in South Korea. And he gets there, teaches himself Korean, which if anybody's been to Korea, you will understand that is no little feat. And brings his staff in to say, if this guy from Minnesota can do it, you need to do it. We're going to learn how to speak Korean here. And we're going to start treating the Koreans as our partners, not as our subordinates. And that leads to some changes in South Korean military operations that led to General Vessey being revered by the South Koreans to this day. So much so is his legacy larger than life in South Korea that the United States Department of Defense last year named its joint headquarters in Korea after General Vessey. General Vessey was a trusted confidant of the president of South Korea, which no American general had been prior to that. And he was an intermediary between the South Koreans and the United States Department of Defense and state, a very unique role for a general. He's also the general who was on the watch when 4 tunnels were discovered underneath the DMZ coming from North Korea to South Korea, a clear indication that the North Koreans were preparing to invade South Korea. Vessey proposed a very, very cutting edge military intelligence estimate that said the North Koreans were literally weeks away from invading South Korea. This flew in the face of what all other intelligence estimates up to that time had said. And Vessey put his career on the line to back up that assessment and was able to convince the Department of Defense and a good portion of Congress. But he wasn't able to convince a young presidential candidate by the name of Jimmy Carter. President Carter made it a plank of his campaign promises to reduce the American presence on the peninsula. And as soon as he got into office, he met with General Vessey, heard General Vessey's assessment, assured General Vessey that he would not make any decisions without further consultations, and within 90 days made a public announcement that a division worth of American soldiers were to be taken out of South Korea without telling Vessey it was coming. Blindsided Vessey and the South Koreans. What happens after that is, I think, key to Vessey being chosen by Ronald Reagan. Vessey sticks to his guns and yet obeys the president. But his deputy is interviewed off the record, except the Washington Post put it on record as saying, if the Americans pull out of South Korea, there will be an invasion, and South Korea stands a better than average prospect of being defeated by the North Koreans. Chilling statement by General Singlaub, made it to the White House, and within 24 hours, Singlaub was on an airplane to the Oval Office to be fired. The first American general fired by a president since MacArthur. It was a chilling shot across the bow to General Vessey. Nonetheless, Vessey continued to testify that he believed if America pulled out its soldiers, there would be an invasion. Now, he began to pull soldiers out per the order, but he also testified to Congress on repeated occasions that he thought it was wrong. And he stuck to that truth-telling tact. The chief of staff of the Army's job came open. Vessey was the heir apparent. He was called to the Oval Office from South Korea for an interview with President Carter about the, and as Vessey liked to joke, he flunked his exam and he was told that he would not be selected. He could have any other four-star job in the Army, but he could not have that job. That was a rebuke to Vessey and a statement to the Department of Defense. Heel the party line, do what you're told, or your career will end. Vessey accepted that as the price for telling the truth and began to hunt for a four-star job that he could then move into retirement. Began to build a home in Garrison, Minnesota. And Avis, his wife, actually began to come back in the summer and oversee the building of that house. And for all intents and purposes, they were going to retire. General Shai Meyer, who had been deputy to Vessey in the Army's Ops and Plans Office, became the chief of staff of the Army. And in an amazing turnaround, a junior officer asked a senior officer to be his vice chief, and Vessey became number two to a man who was once his number two. I interviewed dozens of retired active duty generals who served in the Pentagon at that time. None of them heard Vessey complain. None of them ever heard Vessey smear the president, talk behind General Meyer's back, complain about his plight. He spent 3 years doing the Army's business, which is day-to-day operations, disciplining errant generals and pushing projects forward, and prepared his retirement packet. And then a thunderbolt hit him. Secretary Weinberger called him to his office in late 1981 and said that the President of the United States wants to see you and me in 5 minutes. Vessey got his jacket on, went with the Secretary of Defense, and racked his mind for what he had done wrong. Remember his last time in the Oval Office, he had flunked an exam and he assumed he had screwed something up. In the elevator, Weinberger told him, "You're on the short list for selection of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs." And Vessey was shocked. A vice chief of any of the branches had never been chosen to be the chairman. Chairman had always come from the chiefs of the branches. He had never considered that job, never lobbied for that job, wasn't a politician in that way, and was really looking forward to retirement. So he told Secretary Weinberger, I can't go. I can't do this because I promised my wife we're going to retire. And Secretary Weinberger said, you're going to have to tell the president that. And the rest is history. The president interviews Vessey. Vessey passes the interview. Reagan says, I want you to be my chairman. And Vessey says, I can't do it. I got a house and my wife wants to go home. And the president puts his arm around General Vessey and says, go ask your wife. I know what it's like. I got a house in California. To which General Vessey said to me, yeah, I don't think his house and my house were quite alike and probably different circumstances. But he went home, and the famous story in the Vessey family is that Avis cried and said, God's punishing us because you lied about getting into the Army, and now we got to do this. So let's stop there for a minute and see what questions you have, and then we're going to deep dive into the Reagan era and the amazing things General Vessey was able to accomplish with the team that he assembled. Randal, I'll let you moderate, and let's see what questions people might have or comments they want to make.
Sure. Thank you, John. That's a tremendous introduction to him. Thank you for offering that, and we'll encourage our online audience to enter questions via the chat, or given the familiarity of our audience, simply to shout out those questions too. I'll start off with one at least, knowing that your personal relationship with General Vessey, and also noting others on this call who did know him well. Any anecdote that kind of speaks to who he was as a man? Love to get into the chapter 2 that you're going to hit here in a second, his actual service as chairman, but kind of set the stage of who Vessey was as a man, how he saw the world, how he interacted with it.
Well, I'm going to tell you a pretty emotional story. When I saw him in the ICU at North Memorial, he was intubated, and I prayed with him, and he was conscious and aware I was there. Came back the next day, the tube was out, and we had a short conversation, and his one arm was mangled, one arm not. I grabbed his good arm and said, can I pray with you? And he squeezed that arm like a vice. And he said, yes, you can pray with me. I have to live. I have to take care of my wife. Avis was having memory problems at that point, and General Vessey said, she's been faithful to me and to our kids, and I need to be there to take care of her. That's all I needed to know about the man's character. Took his vows seriously, honest as the day is long. And that anecdote I saw lived out in how he cared for his wife as she failed. And he provided for her. And that's something the public never saw, but that is who he was.
Thank you, John. All right. I'm going to give you the green light, I think, to move forward.
Okay.
I'm eager to hear this. You open your comments with, the claim of General Vessey's key role in essentially winning the Cold War, which is fascinating. And as we develop plans to create a brand new facility, how we go about exploring and explaining and interpreting the Cold War is of keen interest. So I'm looking forward to your comments over the next 20 minutes or so. So
sure.
Take it away, sir.
Well, we've got a pretty august audience here today, so I'm not going to insult anybody's intelligence, but I think the average American today has forgotten that we had a war, and it went hot and cold at various times, but we were in a life and death struggle with the Soviet Union. And it came to an end. We never had a parade. We barely even noted it once the dust settled on the collapse of the Berlin Wall. But we're feeling it today in Ukraine. Sweden and Finland joined NATO today because of that Cold War and its aftermath. the lessons of the Reagan era apply today. Mr. Putin is right out of Moscow, Kremlin's Central Soviet Union. And he is trying to resurrect what we defeated. And he's sending us a strong message that General Vessey would have understood completely. And when General Vessey came on board with the Reagan administration had a very, very clear and controversial worldview, summarized in President Reagan's Evil Empire speech to the National Association of Religious Broadcasters. President Reagan had made a living speaking out against communism, and he came to office with very little respect for President Carter's détente efforts, with no respect for any of the intelligentsia that wanted to learn to live with the Soviet Union. Reagan wanted to defeat the Soviet Union, and it scared many, many leaders around the world. They thought he was an unhinged cowboy. At the same time, Reagan waged a very private, personal initiative to negotiate with the Soviets to get rid of nuclear weapons. So he wanted to defeat them, but at the same time, he didn't want to destroy the world. And he knew that what he needed was a strong economy, very robust. He needed to be able to then modernize the military and then check the Soviet advance and roll it back. So when he went looking for a general to replace Dave Jones, there's several stories of how it came about, but Attorney General Meese said to me that he had a stack of 12 generals 201 files to look at. He got to Vessey's and he stopped looking. That's my man. I said, Attorney General, what was it? Courage on the battlefield, courage to tell the truth when leaders don't want to hear it. Muddy boots from having been enlisted, and loyalty. Takes the job that nobody wants and does it well. And Reagan's mantra was, I don't want anybody in my administration that wants a job here. I want to take people away from jobs they really like and appeal to them to serve the country. And in Vessey, that's exactly what he found. He found a man who wanted to go to Garrison, Minnesota, to take care of his family. And Vessey said, that's one of the reasons I need you here. But they shared a World War II background. If you think about it, that administration was the last of World War II veterans. Secretary Shultz had served with the Marines. Secretary Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, had served with the Army, MacArthur's staff, Vessey. You had four men who understood victory in Europe, victory over the Japanese and what it took, who believed in America's greatness. And they believed that the American military was undermanned and had fallen behind in technology. And that President Carter had, for all intents and purposes, underfunded the military, though the last budget of the Carter era actually begins to reverse that. And Reagan wanted a man to build up the military. And Vessey, he found a man who had worked on projects, big ticket items for the Army, understood the process, and could help Congress see these things through. Reagan and Vessey shared the view that the Soviet military was intent on winning. They weren't a passive defensive force. They were assertive, they were modern, and they were aggressive, and they were on the march. Most recently for them into Afghanistan. But they were fighting and supporting fights in Angola. They were all over Central America and South America. And they were aggressive in Eastern Europe. And that challenged American power and dominance. And Reagan wasn't going to have it. He didn't want to live with it. He wanted to roll it back. And in Vessey, he found a man who was willing to lead that way. But they also saw a very unstable Soviet Union that had aging leadership. And Vessey and Reagan were to see three different Soviet chairmen of the Communist Party in their time. And when you have a one-man autocratic totalitarian regime, when you lose senior leaders one after another in a short period of time, you've got instability. And instability with nuclear weapons is not a good thing. So you needed a man with a temperament of patience, a backbone of steel, and a brain of a world champion chess player, because you didn't want to set off a nuclear exchange. But what Reagan wanted to do is he wanted to militarily, economically press the Soviets in every part of the world and in every arena in the world. And they did it. And they did it in ways that are still classified, but in ways that I see Mr. Putin now doing back to us. Misinformation, espionage, arming enemies, covert operations. We did a lot of these things while General Vessey was in power to maximum effect. And we did it with a front line of 4 men who were, I think, unparalleled in commitment and drive. Secretary of Defense Weinberger, Secretary of State Shultz, the head of the CIA, Bill Casey, and Chairman Vessey. These 4 men were close, worked off the same playbook, and though they had many, many tough, heated differences, these were the guys that kept the Soviets up late at night, causing nightmares. And they worked hand in glove. And I'll give you a couple examples. Casey and Vessey met every week for a meal. What does that tell you? These are busy men, men who travel the world, but they made time every week to look at each other face to face. What it tells me is that they coordinated a lot of dark side operations with conventional operations. There's material being exchanged, and there's a playbook that they're working off of, and it was very effective. Vessey and Shultz golfed together on a regular basis, so much so that Shultz teased Vessey, and Secretary Shultz told me this in my interview with him. Vessey told me the same thing. Shultz said, "You've got better communication equipment on the back of your golf cart than I have in most embassies in the world." And that was probably true. State Department was a bit underfunded, but these 2 men worked together to advance the foreign policy of the United States. We talk about diplomacy, information, military, and economic power. These 2 men coordinated the diplomatic and military power of the United States to bring the Soviets to negotiate nuclear weapon reductions and to roll back their forays in Africa and Central America. Secretary of Defense Weinberger and Chairman Vessey met every day. If they couldn't be together in person, they talked on the phone 3 to 4 times a day. Vessey told me that, but Secretary of State Colin Powell verified it for me. Colin Powell was the military aide to Secretary Weinberger and arranged the daily meetings. Never before and since have we had a Secretary of Defense and a chairman that worked so closely, collaborated to such a high degree of efficiency, and actually became best of friends. These 4 men pressed the Soviet Union to its demise. And they did it with a quarterback by the name of President Ronald Reagan. And to a man, they did it in the same way, quietly, without boasting, but with steely-eyed determination. Vessey's role in all this: lead the largest peacetime buildup of the United States forces in history. Take billions of dollars of the people's money, modernize the force, train it, forward deploy it, hem in the Soviet Union, and push it back. That's no easy task. As we watch our Army today struggling to meet its recruiting goals, this military had the same challenges, but it had it in much more difficult times, I would say. Vessey had to field intermediate nuclear missiles in Europe, incredibly controversial, but much needed in order to check the Soviet missiles that were aimed at every NATO ally's capital. He had to work in the irregular warfare arena in Africa and Central America alongside the CIA to beat Soviet-funded insurgencies, one of which became very, very controversial, and that's the one in Nicaragua. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Many people forget Iran and Iraq were at war with each other during almost the entire Reagan administration, and that's where the world's oil was coming from. It was Vessey that had to oversee the free flow of oil as tankers were being bombed by both sides and keep the Persian Gulf open for navigation. He created what we call today CENTCOM and took what Jimmy Carter had created, the Rapid Deployment Force, and he turned it into the hugely successful command that we know as Central Command. That's General Jack Vessey that did that. And then as the Soviets went into Afghanistan, many of you remember President Carter's toughest thing in response was a boycott of the Olympics and a grain embargo. It was Vessey and Casey that came together to help the Mujahideen roll back what the Soviets had done. Again, our meek-mannered Ole and Lena joke-telling general was a steely-eyed warrior. Was leading some strong leaders inside the Pentagon in building up forces quickly, fielding equipment that put us 2 and 3 generations ahead of the Soviets, and then turning the chess table on the Soviets and starting to run the table to the point that by the time Gorbachev comes to power, he's pleading for negotiations with the United States, a total reversal of what had happened 10 years before. Now, I would argue that '83 was the toughest year for General Vessey, for the Department of Defense, and the most dangerous year. And if how you lead in dangerous times is a measure of who you are, and our General Vessey was a titan. So let's take a look at what was going on in '83. Some of which now most of us didn't even remember or didn't know was happening, but when you put it all together, it'll scare you. So the year starts with the president doing 2 things: flat out telling the Soviets how he really feels, evil empire, and then introducing Star Wars, which terrified the Soviets. The idea that we could put a shield over the United States and knock down intercontinental ballistic missiles, thus making us imperious to a nuclear attack, terrified the Soviets and actually convinced the Soviet leadership that we were preparing to attack them. They launched the largest espionage effort of the Reagan administration, Operation Ryan. And it was done under their chairman, Andropov, a very paranoid man, in a country that was paranoid as a result of Hitler's invasion during World War II. And they convinced themselves that we were coming. We were going to do a preemptive strike, and we were going to literally do what Reagan said, and that is beat them. So if you understand that that's going on in the background in 1983 and tensions worldwide are going up, it gives you a sense of the tightrope that General Vessey's walking on, because now he has to field these intermediate nuclear weapons. That just raises the heat 1 more degree, actually 10 more degrees, because now we have a weapon in Europe that's going to check the SS-40 the Soviets have aimed at NATO capitals, and it's actually going to put the Soviet leadership in its crosshairs. We have an intermediate nuclear weapon that can get to you in a matter of minutes and destroy your Soviet leadership. Decapitation strike, a capability we didn't have before. It's a game changer. And it sends the Soviets scrambling to prepare for this invasion. This is against a worldwide anti-nuclear movement that saw literally millions of people. We in the United States had several marches of 1 million or more people out on the streets. You've got political upheaval and unrest, challenging democracies of the world. The term better red than dead came into being during this year. The term peace through strength came in. Those became the opposing bumper slogans to epitomize the tension in the democracies over what are we doing. And many, many world leaders called Reagan absolutely insane. A wild cowboy that was leading us to the apocalypse. Little did they know that Reagan actually did believe in an apocalypse because of his Christian faith and wanted to avert it. And so was privately pleading with the Soviets to negotiate down their nuclear arms, but he wanted verifiable treaties. General Vessey did not believe the Soviets would ever keep their word. And he kept whispering into Reagan's ear, don't give away all the nukes because the Soviets will never keep their word. Distrust was the coin of the realm. So this is churning as Poland is literally revolting against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's threatening to invade Poland. Central America is heating up, with El Salvador being threatened by military operations from Nicaragua, and the United States getting real concerned that we're going to have more communist presence in our hemisphere with an expansionistic Cuban Soviet effort. 10,000-yard runways begin to appear in Grenada, in Suriname, and several other countries in South America with Soviet aid. What do you need a 10,000-yard runway for? You need it for the largest Soviet military aircraft. And then when revetments for the Soviets' jets begin to appear in Grenada and other places, it becomes obvious the Soviets are not intent on just political influence. They're bringing a military influence into the Western Hemisphere. And that ratchets things up another degree. Meanwhile, there's a war going on in Angola with the Cubans fighting on one side and the CIA supporting an army on the other. And there's a war in Afghanistan. If you think the world's complex today, think back to 1983. There's a lot going on. And at the height of it in September, the Soviets shoot down an airliner with an American congressman on it. Many people have forgotten this. This airliner strayed into Soviet airspace and they shot it down, killing everybody on board. And for a brief time, it looked to be an act of war. Turned out to be a bad mistake, but the tensions were so high, all the systems began to move towards a confrontation. And as that is being sorted out, our Marines in the barracks in Beirut are murdered in the largest single act of terrorism in the Middle East to date. 283 military personnel killed in Beirut. This just ratchets things even higher because as the intelligence gets sorted through, how did this happen? Who are the sponsors? Looks like the Syrians. The Syrians are proxies of the Soviets. Is this another chapter in the Cold War? And what do? Then we invade Grenada 24 hours later. A bold military operation to avoid 800 American medical students being held hostage and to make a statement to Cuba and the Soviet Union about the runway there and our determination to do whatever it takes in our Western Hemisphere to stop Soviet expansion. And we do it. And the world's stunned, absolutely stunned, and becomes quickly critical that Reagan again is losing his mind. And here we go. We're being led across the cliff or over the cliff to a world war. Reagan holds fast. His administration stands tall, and the hostages, medical students, come home. And the first young man off the plane kisses the ground, and public opinion turns unanimously in favor of the president's action. And prestige is bestowed upon our military for the first time since the end of the Vietnam War. But what are we going to do to retaliate for Lebanon and Syria? 283 Marines. That is a tough part of the Vessey legacy that led to what I call the tarnishing of his legacy. There was a lot of confusion in the Grenadian invasion. A lot of things didn't go right, but as Vessey said, hey, we won. Nothing goes the way you plan it. It was planned in 72 hours. It was a joint operation, but it was an overwhelming success. But many in Congress use it as an excuse to batter the administration for its what perceived warmongering, lack of coordination, and inability of the chairman to collaborate and to hold together joint operations. It's not a fair criticism, but it's a popular criticism. Preceding and after that, General Vessey gets blasted for $600 toilet seats and $100 hammers. These are examples of defense outlays in this rapid expansion of the military. Vessey gives a credible defense of what happened, but nonetheless, the slander sticks. He's overspending and under-delivering is what his critics are saying. In the midst of that, Senator Goldwater and Representative Nichols lead legislation to reform the chairman's office. And this is opposed by General Vessey and the chiefs of the time, but it's an indictment of him and his style of leadership and how the office is being led, though Secretary Weinberger is very clear, and so is the president, that they're happy with Vessey's work. And most people in the military don't want the reforms being proposed. It's a political movement led by disgruntled officers and the previous chairman, and Vessey's caught in the middle of that. And ultimately, the legislation passes. Finally, Vessey's caught up, unfortunately, after his time in office in the Iran-Contra scandal, and is made a witness against Secretary Weinberger. Secretary Weinberger is the only Secretary of Defense ever to be indicted and found guilty of a felony. He was subsequently pardoned by President Bush. Vessey, his best friend, is forced to testify against him, even though the record is clear. Both Vessey and Weinberger and Schultz repeatedly and vehemently advised the president not to enact the Iran-Contra arms switch, slush fund, et cetera, Nonetheless, they both get tarnished by the outcome due to that colonel that you see on your screen there, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North and Admiral Poindexter. Vessey prematurely leaves. He could have stayed longer, uses the reason that he wants to go home and finish his house and be with his wife. But my research says to me that he left because he saw the chaos in the Reagan administration, the revolving door of National Security Council chairs, chiefs of staff in the White House that were ineffective, and people like Poindexter and Oliver North running wild. He didn't want anything to do with what was going to happen in Iran or the Central American fiasco. But nonetheless, it followed him home. And I think that's why we don't hear as much about him as he is due. People don't do the research to find out the facts. He gets caught up in the headlines. He doesn't go quietly, however. He goes back to Garrison, Minnesota, and he has a very full post-retirement life. I think he takes about 6 months to speak at every potluck dinner in the Missouri Synod Lutheran churches of the upper Midwest. And then President Reagan calls him to go to North Vietnam and figure out what happened to our POWs and MIAs. If you drive by a federal building today and you see an MIA POW flag, Jack Vessey's fingerprints are on that. He's the man that brought the fullest possible accounting and helped us restore and normalize relations with North Vietnam. For that, he earned the vilification of every veterans group in the United States. He was reviled and called a sellout, a shill of the communists, and a flat out liar. No good deed goes unpunished. And I could do a whole book on the great work he did in North Vietnam and the vile that was heaped upon him. Never complained. The only thing he ever said to me was, there were a few times I wonder why I jumped out of the pan into the fire. But his excuse, the president asked, and you don't turn down your president. Quite a patriot. He served till the last day of his life on the Defense Science Board. He's directly responsible for building the World War II monument in Washington, D.C., along with Senator Dole and others. And he was a lifelong, faithful, contributing, vital member of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. He served on a number of boards, led their largest capital campaign to date, and attended services there till the day he died. Great man. sorely missed and a real titan of our Minnesota history. Let me see what questions you have as we wrap up here tonight.
Well, John, that's a breathtaking analysis. Just kind of keeping up with the pace of everything. And, as we reflect upon, more recent history, with Afghanistan and Beirut and Iran and Syria and, all those things we continue to talk about today have their fingerprints back in Vessey's era, no doubt. Clearly, it's fascinating.
They do. Any of your audience, Randall, have a question or comment?
I'm not seeing one pop up, but I'm always happy to monopolize the time if no one else is. If you could, I think you officiated some of his funeral. Can you talk about his passing and where he's laid to rest, please?
Sure. General Vessey, many of you may not be aware, Arlington National Cemetery is where General Vessey planned to be buried, along with his beloved wife of 50 plus years, Avis, his high school sweetheart, who he married right at the end of World War II. But the cemetery was poorly managed, unfortunately, and the site that was promised to him, the offer was rescinded. When Avis died, he was told he'd have to wait weeks before a site would become available, and he was so heartbroken. He accepted a gracious offer to bury Avis near their home in Garrison at the Minnesota Military Cemetery outside of Little Falls, right across the river from Camp Ripley, and a beautiful site for Avis. And literally, you could see General Vessey's broken heart led to his quick demise, and he wanted to be buried next to Avis. And so they're buried in a beautiful site, side by side, at a place that is near and dear to them and their family, near their beloved home, near where General Vessey started at Camp Ripley in Minnesota, where they were born and raised.
Thank you. A question submitted via the chat here. You touched on it here at the end, but his work on POW recovery and tracking and accounting. Could you delve a little deeper into that, please?
Yes, he took that mission in 1986. President Reagan said it'll only take you 6 months. He kept at it for 8 years. Now, this is a man who, when he was in South Korea, looked across the negotiating tables with the North Koreans, and at times spent up to 6 hours silently looking at his opponent, nobody saying anything. Tough negotiators. 8 years of negotiating with the North Vietnamese to get a full account of where are the bodies of the missing? Do you have any living POWs? And if so, where are they? This was wrapped in controversy from the get-go, highlighted by the Rambo movies, highlighted by unscrupulous people who were making up stories of live sightings. It was a mission of mercy that was bound to run into conspiracy theories, to include Soviet conspiracy theories, with a Soviet general throwing in right at the end that the Soviets had POWs from Vietnam. So it was a crazy investigative journey with tough, bitter North Vietnamese opponents, one of whom was General Giap at one time. He and General Vessey had a meeting together. At the end, the North Vietnamese were able to create an accounting system and let the United States put personnel on the ground that enable us to go to sites and to find remains. And in exchange, the United States provided humanitarian relief and ultimately normalized economic relations that led to the economic success North Vietnam has today. An amazing chapter in tough place at a tough time with absolutely no appreciation from all parties, American, North Vietnamese, South Vietnamese. He also negotiated the release of all the South Vietnamese officers that were in re-education camps, and got through Congress legislation enabled all that wanted to come to the United States from those camps to come and settle. Many South Vietnamese their freedom is directly indebted to Vessey's efforts. It was an amazing endeavor, and again, underreported because of the controversy of the time.
Could you speak a little more about what deployment of the missiles to or installation of the missiles in Europe, the tactical missiles, and Vessey's work with NATO leaders, convincing them to accept those missiles in the face of public protest in some cases, and how important that was?
I will. Now I'm going to say a lot of controversial things. So let me say this, Randal. I'm the first guy to write a book about General Vessey. I hope I'm not the last. I'm making broad assertions that I hope scholars will run to ground. I believe I have facts to support him, but future scholarship is due. One of the things that Vessey did was he sent a general by the name of Raleigh Robinson to be our general at NATO. Raleigh Robinson was one of the first four-star African-American generals. He was hand-selected by Vessey to go to NATO and to help convince the NATO military heads they needed to accept the Pershings and the ground-launched cruise missile systems. That appointment of Raleigh Robinson was a stroke of brilliance because General Robinson got the job done. And then it was up to Secretary Schultz to convince the NATO political leaders to do the same against the unpopularity and the movements in their countries against these. Vessey understood why people didn't want nuclear weapons in their backyard, but he also understood that the Soviets were deadly serious and that Warsaw Pact forces, conventional forces facing the United States outnumbered us almost 10-1, and they were modernizing. So we were under strength, under equipped. We needed an equalizer, and we needed to take the gun away from the heads of the NATO leaders by putting a weapon systems that could bring the fight to the Soviets. To do that meant to put the Pershing and the ground-launched cruise missiles to rearm our submarines, etc. We did it, and Vessey was instrumental in making that happen. And I'm telling you, you read all the research. The Soviets took notice fast, and things began to change quickly because now it was two heavyweights staring each other eye to eye, and the Soviets understood the game had changed, and it changed in our favor.
Maybe to wrap up, John, look forward to reading the book. Tell us what the timeline for the book, where it's kind of at in publication, and when we might be able to find it for sale in the museum gift shop or in the museum library.
The Naval Institute Press will be the publisher, and it's in its third round of edits and peer reviews from military historians. I hope this is the last round, and then it goes into the publication queue. Boy, I'm hoping to see something by the end of this year, and then the Association of the United States Army will pick it up and advertise it through the Army magazine and all the different venues they have. So for military historians, it'll show up in the reviews in the back pages of the journals that military historians like to frequent. And I know Randal, the Military Museum, will have some copies up there for visitors.
John Morse, thank you very much. A fortuitous meeting in the aftermath of General Vessey's car accident led to a connection, which leads to some brilliant scholarship on your part, which leads to all of us having a much deeper understanding of the man and the history that he lived, and that legacy is something we continue to have with us to this day. And I really appreciate your opening remarks to kind of bring it to present day, and referring to Putin and the Ukraine and what all that means. Giving it some historical context is terribly important for us, and hopefully our leaders as well. So I I thank you for your time. There's much more to come from the Minnesota Military and Veterans Museum in the weeks and months to come. And for sure, we'll be updating everybody on that pending publication and let everybody know when they can pick it up and devour it for all that the information that we packed into it. So Colonel Morris, thank you very, very much. I appreciate that. Any last word on your end, sir?
Well, thank you, everybody who gave up a summer evening for listening to me. And thank you, Randal and General Nash and the Minnesota Military Museum for your opportunity to do this as well, and for what you're doing on behalf of capturing the history of great Americans like General Vessey and humble Americans like other Minnesotans who've served in uniform. Appreciate you.
Thanks, Chaplain Morris. Appreciate it. If your book is anything less than 1,000 pages, you've only scratched the surface, so there ought to be volumes 2 and 3 coming.
Yeah, right on, sir. Right on. You know, you spent a lot of time with the general. He was a Titan.
Very good. Thank you to all the veterans out there for all that they've done and continue to do. Everyone have a good evening and a safe summer. Do take care. Thank you.